It sounds like you are doing work looking at plant versus animal proteins and how effectively, our bodies can actually utilize those. That's a huge topic. And you've mentioned, and I've talked with people about this before, that obviously different protein sources, they're not all created equal. You can eat 50 grams of protein from over here, 50 from over here. It's going to have a different profile of amino acids. It's going to have a different level of digestibility and absorbability. Are there any general rules there that are generally going to apply when people are thinking about sourcing their protein at the supermarket?
With the plant-based proteins, I was surprised. So we thought that, so first we worked with protein isolates. So corn protein, soy protein, pea protein. And then we thought that if you give 30 grams of that protein, you see a lesser response than an equivalent amount of dairy protein. And we've seen that before for gluten, for example. Other labs have shown that from soy. And so we started giving 30 grams of protein isolates of a plant origin and compared it to dairy protein. We saw no difference. So 30 grams of protein was either way enough to compensate for lesser quality, because you can compensate for lesser quality by greater quantity. And if we give 30 grams of protein isolates from a plant source, even if they are deficient to a certain amino acid, we see no impact on the postprandial stimulation of muscle protein synthesis.
And that was protein isolate. So do you mean like a powder?
A powder, those protein powders. Now, so those studies didn't show a difference. And we thought like, oh, so in a single meal, also a deficiency in a specific amino acid doesn't have a massive impact, negative impact on muscle protein synthesis. There could be two explanations. One, that 30 grams is enough to compensate for any lesser quality. Or secondly, that there's already enough of that specific amino acid that is deficient in the protein circulating around in the human body. Two possible explanations. So we wanted to take it one step further and just look at a more practical way. But of course, most scientists, including myself, we don't like to go to the practical way because then there's a lot of inclarities and insecurities. Mm-hmm. So what we did is we provided subjects, the same subjects crossover, with exactly the same meal. The same meal with regarding the energy content and protein content. But one meal completely vegan. So a very balanced meal with all kinds of plant-based foods. So no protein powders, but whole foods in the whole foods matrix. Versus a typical old school Dutch meal, piece of meat, potatoes, veggies, and some apple juice. Now, that meal with the meat actually saw a robust increase in muscle protein synthesis. With the vegan meal, we didn't see any response. Now, everybody will actually say like, oh man, he's promoting animal-based foods. No, I'm not, because I see a lot of benefits in a more plant-based diet. But it was obvious that there was an attenuated increase in circulating amino acids. And of course, that is a huge factor in driving the anabolic response to feeding. Does that mean that the vegan food is not stimulating muscle protein synthesis? Not within the time frame that we assessed. Now, we're following this up over 10 days to see whether we apply this in a full diet, whether it also actually minimizes muscle protein synthesis. Mm-hmm. Now, these studies are undergoing, and we're doing those. But of course, you don't have a very nice comparison anymore, because then you have protein throughout the day, you have meal on meal effect.
Yeah.
And of course, when you go for a vegan diet, a lot of people start eating meat replacers or meat alternatives. And of course, many of those are made from protein isolates. And so the digestibility is less of an issue there.
Okay, so you had two types of meals. One was strictly plant-based. It was a vegan meal. One was an omnivorous diet. It had meat and veggies and other things. They were matched for protein, grams of protein. They were matched for total calories. But then, of course, all of the other things are going to differ between them. All the overall nutrient profile. In principle, how do you think about what accounts for the difference here? Is it the digestibility of the physical protein contained in the foods? Is it the presence or absence of other nutrients that affect digestibility and absorbability? all of that stuff?
It's a combination of everything, of course, but I think the fact that we didn't see the difference in the plant-based proteins and even the plant-based protein blends, we saw a perfect response. So if you take the plant-based protein isolates with 30 grams, it was fine. But then when we provided that as whole foods, there was an issue. So I assume that most of it is due to the reduced digestibility, the less bioavailability of these plant-based whole foods for the human body. And that is anti-nutrition. I mean, I hate the term anti-nutritional factors. Yeah. I mean, fibers can be regarded anti-nutritional factors, but I think they're very important nutritional factors.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate term because it implies they're bad, but that's not necessarily
exactly.
Okay, so interesting. So you give this omnivorous meal, meat, potatoes, other things. You see the protein synthesis response. You don't see that with the whole food, entirely plant-based vegan diet. But you told us before about those experiments you did with plant-based isolates. And so essentially what you're saying is what's plausibly happening here is the isolates, the powders, it's sort of pre-digested. But if you have these whole foods, the protein, the amino acids are bound up physically in a way that our bodies just are unable to absorb.
And most of the guidelines on a vegan diet actually include that you might you might want to compensate for the lower digestibility of the protein in your plant-based foods by consuming more protein. Mm-hmm. So you see that in various countries, there's advice that if you follow a vegan diet, that you actually consume more protein than advised on a partially animal-based diet.
Mm-hmm. Is just in terms of just overall health and making sure that your body hits its nutritional requirements to be a basic healthy person, not necessarily a bodybuilder or an Olympic athlete or anything, just a normal person who's in good health. There's obviously lots of confusion out there. There's lots of opinions out there. People get almost religious with their beliefs in this diet versus that diet, this routine versus that routine. Are there particular axes of variation that you think are better to think along first for people? So for example, is it good to think in terms of whole foods versus processed foods? Is it useful to think about plant versus animal? Is it useful to think about, there's many different axes of variation here. Are there one or two that you think are going to be very useful for most people to think about?
I think the most important thing is keep thinking. And sometimes when people become beliefs, people don't think about it anymore. So we get the strangest responses to publications or from studies that we do. And they say like, hey, you think that the meal with meat does better than a vegan meal, so you must be supporting plant-based or animal-based foods. But then they forget that there's also a study with plant-based proteins where we show no differences. So just don't make it into a belief, but think about it. If you ingest proteins from a plant-based diet on whole foods, do understand that your body is not capable of getting all that protein out. So if you want to compensate for that, either eat more or eat some animal-derived proteins on top of that. If you have a plant-based diet, is it more important to actually be more to have more different foods in your diet? Of course, because some of the plant-based foods are deficient in specific amino acids. Actually, if you combine them, you are less likely to have deficiencies. To be honest, I think I spent probably 30 million euros of research money in nutritional research. And most of the things that I've actually provided clinical proof of is that my mom was always right. And it's pretty amazing. I mean, we have provided clinical evidence that you should eat 3 times a day with different macronutrients, with sufficient protein, that protein is actually delivered on the right spot if you are physically active between the meals. And might also be good to have some milk and cookies before going to bed. And if you eat, sit upright and chew well. That's about the legacy of all the work that my group has done over the last 25 years.
What do you mean it might be good to have milk and cookies before bed?
Yeah, that's just because some people, but we've done some work on overnight muscle protein synthesis. And so we had some discussions on whether your gastrointestinal tract actually processes protein. And so what we did is we provided this intrinsically labeled protein through a nasogastric tube in the gut while people were sleeping. And this was a really cool study in older adults. So these older adults, they are much more fun to work with than athletes. They call us instead of we call them. They call us every year and say, like, look, it's been a year that I've been in the lab. Don't you have a cool study that I can contribute to? And then I tell them, like, you know what? You come over next week. We put a nasogastric tube down your gut. We take a muscle biopsy. We make you sleep in the lab. Then we tiptoe into the lab at 2:00. Put 40 grams of intrinsically labeled protein that is heated in your gut without waking you up. And in the morning, I'll wake you up with a muscle biopsy at 7:00. And then they say, where can I sign up? It's really amazing. But what that study showed is that while you sleep, your gut actually digests the protein. We see with retractable lines, we see those amino acids being released into the circulation. And in the morning, we see the conversion of that protein to muscle. Now, strangely enough, when we published that study, I got phone calls from coaches all over the world asking me where they could get those nasogastric lines. That was a bit weird. Because that was a conceptual study to show that if you ingest protein before you go to sleep, that it's normally digested, absorbed, and might help recovery throughout overnight and stimulate muscle loss. So I had to explain these guys that you don't have to use nasogastric tubes for your athletes, but simply have a protein-rich snack in the evening, which most athletes nowadays do, because that's one of the 4 or 5 meals that they ingest. In the early days, bodybuilders actually put their alarm clock at 3:00 to get some protein in.